My name's Melissa Gutierrez. I am currently completing my 5th year at San Diego State. Spent approximately 7 years in California's foster care system throughout the county of San Diego. So I'm born and raised San Diego. I've lived here my whole life and I love it. My first experience in care was when I was an infant. I don't remember it. And I've been in and out of the system throughout that time. So my first was, I think I was about 6 months. And then there were intermittent periods where I was in care, and then I would be placed back with my biological mom, and then I was placed back in. And when I was 14, that was the most recent time that I had been placed in, and I was in foster care until I aged out at 18. I had been placed in approximately 5 different homes. Thinking offhand, I spent a couple weeks in what is called a way station, and that's actually a placement that is very short-term foster care, and it's meant to be that place that you can go directly after being removed from the home, but before they found you a more long-term suitable housing arrangement. And so I was there in that way station. It was very chaotic. It's a foster home that's been designated with either 1 or 2 foster parents. And that particular home, they were very enthusiastic about foster care, so they had all different ranges of foster youth coming in and out. And the idea with the way station is that it's meant to be temporary, so you'll see a constant rotation of kids coming in for a couple days, for hours, for a month, or a month or 2 tops. After the way station, I was placed with a very loving family, very nice. It was a single mom, very hard worker, and she had 2 sons, about age 12, and they were living at home along with her older daughter that was in college at the time. I think she was in her 20s. Because over time, I stayed there, I want to say about 8 months or so. It's hard to keep track of timelines, but there just became a point where it was hard for my foster mom to balance 4 children. She had the boys, she had twin boys entering teenagerhood, so that's a challenge in its own right, as well as her college age daughter, and then myself transitioning through high school. And I think it just became a lot for her to handle, as well as the fact that I was going to a separate high school, and so there were 3 different schools that she was coordinating, and so she just realized that it was a lot to handle. And so we sat down and she talked about the consideration of a different placement, somewhere that might be able to take care of my needs more appropriately. Because at that time I was about 15, so it's about the time when teenagers start becoming interested in things like driving and gaining autonomy, but because you're a ward of the court, you aren't allowed those privileges, in the sense that most foster parents will not put you onto their insurance because it's considered a liability, or they don't have an extra vehicle for you to be able to use. And so even though I wanted to start to learn how to drive and be able to drive myself around, that was just never an option. And so it would be her taking me to high school and picking me up, although sometimes her daughter would pick me up as well, and so she helped with that. I remember as a 16-year-old or 15-year-old at the time feeling very confused and conflicted, because I had so many emotions happening in myself. I had anger and sadness, deep sadness about being taken away from my biological mother, but at the same time I feel like I wasn't necessarily allowed to feel those emotions, or I had to keep them contained. They were only allowed to be displayed either by myself or in certain situations where it was appropriate, because if I lashed out or if I did something against my foster family, there was a constant threat hanging over my head of I would be removed, I would be taken somewhere else that may be even less appropriate than where I am now. And so those I guess inclinations of a teenager to want to adventure out and hang out and have romantic relationships, those were all things that were filtered through my lens of having to remember that I was a ward of the court. And so I remember wanting to date and wanting to have a boyfriend, and that was a really difficult experience because I had no idea, I had no training on the social nuances of how to approach that, and every family has a different belief system and what they think is okay and not. And at that time when I was with that family, she was very hesitant of dating at 15. She just thought that was too early. And so I remember being picked up from a party once, and I had been asked out by one of my close friends, and I was so excited about it. It was this wonderful thing to me, and I wasn't sure how to present it, so I just sort of said, well, I guess such and I are dating now. And my foster mother's response was, no, this isn't happening. This is why it isn't happening. This isn't going to happen. And it wound up being this very strained relationship of we eventually sort of worked out some parameters with it and details. But everything was very structured. Everything had to be reviewed, including if I wanted to even stay over at a friend's house, it had to be screened and approved first. Pretty much every family I was with, it was to varied levels. I mean, I felt more comfortable in some placements than others, but especially towards the end because I was moved out of that family to a different family, and the next family I was with was very, very staunch and just very conservative, which is I mean, that's fine, that was their belief system, but it was hard for me because it conflicted with everything that I had been brought up with and how I felt and perceived the world, and so I couldn't understand some of the views that they held to so dearly. And then it also became hard for me when I wanted to go out with my friends or I wanted to have some independence because I was a liability. They were extra cautious and they were very careful and didn't want to take any risks or have me take any risks that might come back on them, and so I was restricted in that way. Normal teenagers that are even doing everything right, which I thought I was. I was working hard. I would go to school. I would take the bus across town to go to work. I would work until 9 o'clock and then go home and do the same thing the next day. I wasn't involved in drugs or anything like that, but it's hard. It's just hard raising a teenager as it is, and I think that those challenges and those things, the issues you see, especially with foster youth, the pregnancies and drugs, are more often just dealt with in removing the child than it is any sort of blame being placed on the foster parents, on the structural issues that came into play. It's just the burden and the consequences would always fall on the foster youth instead of anyone else. Really, my fondest memories of being in care were with my last placement. So when I was in high school, just a few months before graduation, I had been asked to leave my current placement, and I was having all of these issues because I had been one of the very few to be able to stay in one high school over this transitory period as I was moving all over San Diego County. The one thing my rock was really being able to be in school with my friends. And when I was telling my friends about what was happening and that I was going to be placed up again and I didn't know where I was going to be staying, if I was even going to be able to graduate with them, one of my girlfriends asked her parents if they would be willing to take me in until the end of the year, the end of the school year even. And I wound up being taken in by my friend's family. And upon arriving to their house, I was given a house key, which I had never been allowed to have before. In other placements, I was given the opportunity to choose which colors I wanted to paint my new room, and so many different things that were the above and beyonds to me of them making me feel comfortable and at home, and that I really wasn't part and a member of this household. I now consider them my adopted family. We never went through it legally, but they really are my second family now. And one of those factors was that she never saw me as a foster kid, or she never looked at my file. She just knew me as her daughter's friend that she had seen growing up throughout the years, that she knew was a very capable person and didn't see any issues with that. And so it was interesting because the placement before that also had no experience with foster care, but I feel like that was very negative to my experience, whereas being with my friend's family who already had a sense of who I was as a person instead of as a product of care really made a difference in their entire lens of how to view me, and then realizing the limitations and possibilities and all the things that go into that. So they were just always very open and casual about everything, instead of me feeling very disconnected and like I was imposing, because that was always the feeling I felt of before that. I'm a burden and I'm imposing on these families, and they already have, especially with them all already having the biological children, you just feel like you're kind of thrown into this existing schema that's been going on for so long. They already have everything set up and figured out, and then you have to go in and try and figure out and navigate everything exactly. And literally it would be every other word out of my mouth I was so concerned about, because you just say one wrong thing and it can put that thought of, well, maybe it's time to reconsider this placement into their head, whereas that would never be the case with their teenagers or their biological children. The longer I stayed with that family, because they said, just because the school year's ending, you're not getting kicked out, which was my assumption, that as soon as I turned 18, that was it, because I was no longer required, but they never said that. They said, no, you're welcome here and to stay here whenever you need, as long for that, as if it's summer breaks, if it's spring break, any of those. And so once they told me that, and I knew that they really meant it, that they weren't going to take their word back, that's when I started letting my guard down and feeling comfortable and just being myself and exercising a little bit more autonomy and just sort of seeing how much independence they would allow me to have. And through that, I was able to have my own life, and sure, I made mistakes, but I grew, and I felt I really learned a lot. And those were my best experiences of going out and experiencing things for the first time, in the sense of a young person working and trying to be a successful adult, instead of someone who keeps hitting a barrier because of the system or family placement or anything else. a lot of foster youth have the unfortunate stigma associated with them just by, as soon as you say something like I'm a foster youth or I'm a foster kid, or someone knows that about you, there's a lot of perceptions and misconceptions that come with that. And I always encourage everyone to just not judge a book by its cover, and try and get to know someone and have a conversation with them. Realize that tough exterior has probably been built up for a reason and because of a lot of past hurts, and that can affect your outlook now. But there's always room for growth and change. And I know that personally I've grown so much, and I've been able to broaden my perspective, and I'm a much happier, positive person now because I was able to relax and to not constantly be worrying about things like housing and where I'm going to be staying and what's happening with the next court date. It's just sort of, it's a process, and I think every teen and youth should be allowed to have that process as much as any other person.